Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Minister, I would like to welcome you on the second day of our conference. Today, the first panel concerns the losses of Poland. We have 7 speakers and 3 hours and a half for it, with a short coffee break. That is why I would like to ask you to keep the discipline in speaking, to observe the time limit, because otherwise we won't be able to have even a short moment for a discussion. I would like to welcome the first person who is going to deliver the introductory lecture. This is Ms. Lynn Nicholas, a distinguished independent researcher concerning the art looted by the Nazis on the occupied areas during the Second World War. She is the author of the famous book The Rape of Europe, published in 1994, and she was rewarded with National Book Critics Circle Reward, and in 1996 the book was adapted with the same title. Ms. Lynn Nicholas studied in the Harvard University and in Oxford University. She also worked in the National Art Gallery in Washington. The book that was published in Poland in translation, the Polish title is Grabież Europy. And she was also awarded with the title of Amicus Polonia. And also she's the author of many publications concerning the above-named problems. Ms. Lynn Nicholas is going to deliver a lecture concerning the Nazi lootings in Poland, ideology and practice. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I hope everyone can hear. I would first like to thank the Minister of Culture and Professor Puchala for organizing this extraordinary event. And particularly I would like to thank Ambassador Winit, the Polish ambassador to the United Nations, for making the effort to come, with Anna Perls, who's from the Polish embassy in Washington. And both of them many years ago worked very hard in initiating restitution efforts in the United States, and they continue to do so. And of course, I would particularly like to thank the wonderful staff who've kept all of the nervous and late and speakers who get lost and don't know where to eat and things like that. You're taking very good care of us, so it makes it a very nice occasion. The transfer of works of art from vanquished to victor is as old as warfare itself. So the fact that it happened in World War II is really not very surprising. But the displacement of works and the destruction of monuments in this war was really quite unprecedented. Never before had objects been moved about on such a scale, not hundreds or thousands, but millions of objects of every description. These are books in the Soviet Union being stacked up and having been taken from all over the place, but the same sort of thing happened in Poland. Also unique were the ideological and legal and political arguments put forth to justify the removals, as well as the fact that for the first time in history, the armies of all the belligerents eventually had highly trained art specialists in their ranks, one of my favorites being Edith Standen, a monuments woman from the United States. And it was their duty to secure and preserve monuments and movable works of art, and their professionalism, no matter what their ideology, because there were many Germans involved in this, saved most of the treasures of Europe for us. Especially notable among them is Karl Estreicher, shown here, bringing back the lady with the ermine to Poland. He was one of the earliest monuments men whose persuasive efforts in London before the Allied invasion of Europe and clear methodology for listing losses were of tremendous importance to those who came after him and who worked with him. The Nazi invasion of Poland took place 75 years ago. The true character of that invasion is really not well known to the general public in the West, where the events of the conquest of France, this is Caen in Normandy, the Blitz in Great Britain, and the later dramatic Allied invasions of Italy and Germany have for a long time taken center stage. But the invasion of Poland and the actions of Nazi occupation authorities in this country represent more purely than events almost anywhere else the true ideology of Hitler and his minions. As elsewhere, Nazi racial ideology was the basis for every action, whether it related to art or anything else. But here, these policies were not delayed or gradually introduced, but immediately implemented. In late August 1939, Hitler urged his forces to, quote, act brutally, be harsh and remorseless, and to, quote, kill without mercy all men, women, and children of Polish descent or language in the coming extermination of Poland. The objective in Poland and later the Soviet Union was the acquisition of a vast territory, or Lebensraum, which we all know, that word, that would be cleansed of alien races, be they Slavs, Jews, or Roma, and so forth. And it would be repopulated by pure Aryans from Germany itself and by the forced migration of millions of other ethnic Germans, at first from the Baltic states and later from various conquered Soviet regions, and eventually from all over the world. They had an extraordinary program in the United States, for instance, trying to recruit German Americans to, revoke their citizenship and come and help populate these areas. A new agency under Himmler, the Reich Commission for the Strengthening of Germandom, the RKFDV, was set up in early October 1939 for the resettlements that would be needed to establish the Nazi Utopia. Here, I think it's very interesting, these images of the disastrous effort to create this utopia, which is, these are forced migration movements where they're moving ethnic Germans from somewhere in Eastern Europe to Poland to populate the villages. To make room for these settlers, the great mass of the ethnic Slavic populations of Poland and the Soviet Union were to be deported eastward. And these are all scenes from this forced migration. These people, many of whom didn't speak German and would suffer terrible starvation and death, and they really didn't want to be moved like this. More scenes. Eventually, the Slavic population was to be deported beyond the Ural Mountains, and meanwhile, those remaining in the new territories would be reduced to slave labor and slow but certain death, and this would include children. In Poland, the western areas were immediately annexed to Germany, and thousands of residents given only a few hours' notice before being deported. The new German occupants of their houses were often dismayed to find food still on the tables when they were moved in. One can only speculate about the fate of personal possessions and collections in this scenario. In this annexed area, and eventually the rest of Poland, all but Germanic cultures and religious institutions were to be erased. This would include not only Judaism, but even the Catholic Church, a policy that was first felt in Poland. Polish universities were closed, and orders were given to prepare lists of Polish government leaders, nobility, clergy, professionals, and intellectuals of all type for a fate as yet unclear. The fate for many, as we heard yesterday too, was to be sent to concentration camps like Sachsenhausen. The Jewish population was to be put in ghettos where starvation and death would prevail, and soon transportation to death camps would decimate them. The hundreds of thousands of Poles deported from the West would be transported to remote areas in the Generalgouvernement, a new separate province created where Polish life would be allowed to continue, but for these people who were transported to the remote areas, really virtually no arrangements were made for their reception or survival, and they would just be sort of dumped somewhere and were on their own to create their own little colony. Trains were at a premium in this process, and competition for cattle cars would become fierce when deportations of Jews began to the same area. The Nazis would devote enormous bureaucratic and financial resources both to the final solution and to the Slavic resettlement. The latter, for example, involved such programs as the physical classification of the entire Slavic population in various categories that would each have a specific use, and the forced Germanization of those considered to be of German, considered salvageable. This is one example of a form, a child who was put in a children's home. And if you can, I don't know if you can read it, but the discussion is about, we don't know what his political leanings might be or what he might feel when he gets out of here, but, and in the end he would be given a little classification, that stamp down at the bottom, which would determine what sort of work he would be able to do. Many of these children were sent to Germany for forced labor, and others were simply kidnapped and given to families in Germany as foster children, which would cause a great distress after the war and of course during the war. The Germanization would even include Copernicus, who was declared to be of German blood. And as we know all too well, millions would die and be permanently uprooted in the attempted implementation of these ethnic theories, which sadly have not entirely disappeared from the world today. In this purification of the East, anything Germanic must be saved. This principle would govern the forms of looting in Poland. In Germany itself, the cleansing of the art world pre-war had been focused on the purging of degenerate art from the German collections. This is a picture by Franz Marc, never mind that he had died in World War I fighting for Germany. Gross, of course, you can see why this might not have been acceptable to the Prussian military group. And even Käthe Kollwitz, who, because she was anti-war, she was not allowed to exhibit during all of the war. Along with including this purging of art from the collections came the destruction of Jewish cultural institutions and the collection of their assets. The main emphasis in Poland, while continuing these policies, would be on returning Germanic art to the fatherland and safeguarding top-notch non-Germanic art from unworthy Polish collectors for the edification of the master race. The most obvious example of this, of course, is the wonderful altarpiece right here, the Wittstoss altarpiece. It was created by a German artist, but commissioned by the King of Poland. But to the Nazi mind, the fact that it was made by someone of German blood was sufficient justification for its removal to the Reich. The same fate would later befall the Amber Room in the Soviet Union, taken from the Catherine Palace outside St. Petersburg, a gift from the Prussian king to Peter the Great. Poland was certainly no stranger to looting. Her major collections had been moved repeatedly for nearly 200 years, depending which group of enemies was invading. And as long as the possibility, and as the possibility of invasion became clearer, many of the great collections here were sent to what seemed to be safety. But this, unfortunately, did not always work out as expected. The great tapestries from the Wawel, and this is one of my favorites, were evacuated just as hostilities began. It was really quite a trip. They were shipped down the Vistula on a barge that was bombed en route, then put on a truck that took them to Romania, from whence they went to France via Italy, where the Pope had refused to give them shelter for fear of political problems. From there, they were shipped to the living room of the Polish ambassador in London, who had a little trouble storing them, and eventually they went to Canada, where they became prisoners of the Cold War and would remain for a very long time, but fortunately they are now home. But most things, though moved out of the cities, remained hidden within the countryside. Among them, the Czartoryski collections, the altarpiece from the Church of Our Lady here that was dismantled and stored, and the treasures of many other churches across the nation. Similar measures were taken all over the continent, European continent, and even in the United States. And it's interesting to show a few examples. This is the collections of Venice being taken to safety, but one does really wonder if this was a very safe way to move them, but I guess they're used to it there. In France, the Winged Victory was taken down the stairs of the Louvre very carefully, and everyone was afraid that she was going to fall into 100 bits, but she made it. And this is the Grand Gallery of the Louvre after the things were evacuated. In the United States, the National Gallery sent the 75 best works from its collection, which was quite small in those days. The gallery had only opened in 1941 to a pseudo chateau in North Carolina. But these measures in Poland, the ones that are normally taken to protect collections from damage and warfare, would prove futile here. The invaders were very well informed and had no intention of leaving any part of these Slavic-owned collections intact. German scholars of worldwide distinction, such as Dagobert Frey and Gustav Bartel, had been studying the Polish collections for years, and there was really no place to hide. There were 4 major, well-funded Nazi bureaucracies that concerned themselves exclusively with art matters, and they were supported by the full force of Nazi military and police organizations. Hitler's personal agency, the Sonderauftrag Linz, was established to build up a vast collection for a museum complex he planned to build in his hometown of Linz. Its operations were monitored daily by Hitler, even at the Wolfschanze, which we were talking about yesterday. He would get dispatches about what had been bought for his collection, even in the middle of a battle. Hermann Goering spent even more time on art matters and also had a large personal staff devoted to his collecting. And Alfred Rosenberg, the ideological lead guru of the party, set up another entity known as the ERR that was first limited to collecting items such as Masonic and socialist and Jewish libraries, but soon expanded into all fields of art, and when Rosenberg headed the Ostministerium, would be very active in the Soviet areas. The SS had its own operations. Their Ahnenerbe, or an ancestral study organization, focused on archaeology, a field which they dominated in Germany at the time, but all of their agencies would be active in looting Jewish and national collections in Poland. All of these agencies would be active in looting Jewish and national collections in Poland, including libraries and archives. And you will hear much more about these activities in later talks during this conference, particularly the SS Commando Paulsen, which was very important here. The Nazi organizations were very competitive, and efforts by the Nazi leaders to control the excesses of their underlings were not always successful. In Poland, operational territories were quite divided. Experiences in Austria and Czechoslovakia had taught the Nazi leaders that tight control of high-level official looting was essential. Thus, the man who had organized the rearrangement of the Austrian collections, Cajetan Muhlmann, was sent to Krakow with the title of Special Commissioner for the Protection of Works of Art in the occupied areas. But he's shown here with Hans Frank at the Wawel. But by the time he arrived, competition in the form of the SS Ahnenerbe and various other entities were already in action. They had, for example, already found and removed the Wittstoß altar and replaced it with this sort of pathetic little tiny altarpiece. Warsaw Castle was being plundered by virtually anyone and was mined for destruction. Churches, synagogues, the estates of the nobility, and other private collections were being systematically looted by SS operatives in the countryside. And thousands of works were being gathered in the National Museum in Warsaw and in the Wawel right here. It was Muhlmann's job to sort out and safeguard the looted items so that the Nazi leaders could decide what they wanted. His operations were centered in the Generalgouvernement, now governed by Hitler's ex-lawyer Hans Frank. And much to the dismay of the SS that had its own storage system, yet another agency controlled by Goering was set up in Berlin to receive his and Hitler's loot. And despite various decrees emphasizing that Hitler and Goering had first choice of what was taken, this arrangement would produce constant bureaucratic warfare over the allocation of objects. By the winter of 1940, Muhlmann had gathered most of the most important works from the Generalgouvernement in Krakow. A very elegant catalog of the most important items divided into 3 categories according to artistic importance, and complete with provenance, which freely said that they had come from Polish collections, and photographs, was prepared. Less important objects were stored but not forgotten. Hitler's curator, Hans Posse, came to examine what had been taken and did not actually take very much from Poland, limiting himself to the 3 top works in the Czartoryski collection and a number of things from Warsaw. In a letter of 1939, he claimed a number of works already procured by the SS, including numerous church treasures. In the same letter, he mentioned his hope that they would before long be able to salvage, I quote, the famed Dürer drawings in the Lviv Museum that had fallen into Russian hands, a rather telling comment on the realities of the German pact with the Soviet Union. And indeed, only 6 days after the German invasion of the USSR, Dr. Muhlmann went off to safeguard this prize too. It's interesting to note that the Czartoryski works were never formally cataloged in the Linz collection. After going to Berlin for a time, they were sent back to Krakow, safer there as there was no bombing. And as we all know, they were taken west at the end of the war under perilous conditions and with some major exceptions, recovered by the Western Allies. I was talking to Dr. Kudelski, who's written a new book about the Raphael, and he says they don't know where it is, but they're sure that it still exists, so I think that's good news. The Dürer drawings, on the other hand, were used to decorate the personal lodgings of Hitler and traveled with him all during the war. Muhlmann didn't just gather things for the top Nazis. After he'd organized the Polish loot, he was called to the Netherlands to do the same, but there the situation was totally different. While there was a great deal of direct looting in the Netherlands, this is the Rathenau Rembrandt, a self-portrait, and the Mannheimer collection. He also made a very elegant catalog of their collection, again, with photographs and provenance. But the main displacement of works of art in the Netherlands would take place through the art trade, some straightforward and some not. For instance, the Chabot collection was sold at auction during the occupation. Meanwhile, the national collections of the Netherlands, which was considered a Germanic nation, were not yet disturbed, although there were plans to rearrange things later. And this is the Night Watch as it looked in storage during the war. First, it was stored in the dunes north of Amsterdam, and then later moved to Maastricht. While in Poland, Muhlmann had been made quite aware of the desire of the German museums and cultural institutions to acquire objects from the looted stores, as well as on the art markets of the occupied nations. The Nazi mayor of Breslau, for instance, mounted a continuing campaign to get things from Poland and later Holland. These desires soon made clear that there were great opportunities for trade between the various occupied nations and Germany itself. The new Nazi settlers in Poland wanted to enhance their residences with nice pictures, and items from Poland could also be sold in the West. Works acquired in Holland from dealers this is one, or confiscated from Jews, would soon start appearing at auctions in Germany. From there, they would move on to German museums and private collectors, as well as to the oligarchs who ruled the new Nazi Gaus and provinces in the East. These men had pretensions no less grandiose than their chiefs in their desires to create a new civilization. New museums were created, for example, in Königsberg, Kaliningrad, which would eventually house the Amber Room, taken from the Soviet Union. Muhlmann, funded by occupation money from Poland, shipped carloads of paintings and objets d'art back to Hans Frank from all over Western Europe. One surviving 1941 invoice from Janssen, an elegant dealer in Paris, for over 500,000 French francs, shows purchases by the Frank family, his wife was quite a shopper too, of rugs, lamps, elaborate furniture, etc. Of course, there was a little commission for Muhlmann and some of his cronies in each such transaction. Other clients included Baldur von Schirach, the Danzig Museum, the director of the Germanische Museum, and hundreds of others. Muhlmann, with close contacts to the Nazi rulers of Poland, was well aware of the progress of the war and the precarious state of the collections remaining in Poland, and it was lucky that he had the foresight to store large amounts of art in the Wawel in Krakow. The destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and later of virtually the entire city, including this castle, would prove him right. And in that chaotic episode, and later in the Soviet Union, from the disastrous events on the Eastern Front, carloads of uncatalogued art and books and archives would be shipped to Poznan and elsewhere, or simply be stolen by persons unknown. The turn of the tide in the war would soon require the removal of the Krakow stores to the west. Much would head to Silesia and Thuringia to join the items simultaneously being occupied there before the Western allies. One example of that is a Dürer Madonna from Dresden that was stored there. One of the last things to leave here was the Leonardo, along with Governor Frank himself. And later, in a truly heroic operation by the German provincial curator for Lower Silesia, Dr. Gunther Grundemann, some of the greatest masterpieces would again be evacuated to Coburg and eventually be secured. But thousands of lesser objects, and some major ones like the Raphael, would not be so fortunate and be scattered, destroyed, or vanished to reappear in places around the world. I have little detailed information on the movement of works from the areas taken by Soviet forces, but a great deal sure did go in that direction, as it did from Germany. This Degas, which was taken from Germany, is now at the Hermitage, and everyone would hope that it might be released someday. So I look forward very much to presentations we will hear later today on that subject. The task of restitution among the Western allies, who would slowly gather the loot they found in a series of collecting points at Munich, Offenbach, Wiesbaden, and various others, was daunting, not least because of the destruction of German infrastructure, difficulties of communication and transport. Whoops, getting ahead of myself. Difficulties of transport. This is Berchtesgaden, where the 82nd Airborne is evacuating Goering's trains, which was not their usual work. Things were complicated by divergent policies in each zone, the demands to use works of art for reparations, and eventually by the advent of the Cold War and total lack of cooperation by the Soviets. The basic policy in the West was to repatriate objects to the governments of the countries from which they had been taken. This is the Ghent altarpiece closed. Special commissions in each country, not always free of influence from special interests, would then deal with restitution. This would cause great difficulties as time went on and still affects restitution cases today, in part because of the fact that many claimants did not or could not return to their countries and would make claims from elsewhere. Difficulties would also arise due to independent political decisions by Allied officials. A prime example is the fate of the Mariinsky drawings by Dürer, the ones so carefully retrieved by Muhlmann. An American official, all too aware of the imminent fall of the Iron Curtain, and contrary to American policy, returned them to a relative of the family resident in the West, who not only had not informed the rest of the family, but who then sold them to museums and collectors all over the world. Poland still claims them, and so does Ukraine, as Lviv is in its territory. The present owners say they bought them in good faith, which is actually sort of true, and so we have a familiar impasse. In the first year or so after the end of the war, enormous amounts of cultural items were secured, identified, and returned from the special collecting points set up by the Western Allies. The quantities and variety of items was vast. They included books, Jewish ritual objects, paintings, sculpture, and even church bells. Representatives of the affected nations, including the Soviet Union, were invited to come to the collecting points to identify the objects. Among them, the famous Rose Valland, played by Cate Blanchett recently in the movies. And within a short time, truckloads and trainloads of displaced objects were going back to the countries from which they had been taken. In late April 1946, a train of 27 cars brought the first items back to Poland. The lady with the ermine and much more returned to Krakow. Although the repatriation train was welcomed with much ceremony, as we heard yesterday, it was an uneasy homecoming due to political unrest in Poland and overly casual arrangements by the Americans. The train unfortunately arrived in the midst of competing demonstrations celebrating the Communist May Day and the Polish Constitution Day, and the ceremonies in Krakow were fraught with drama. Such major returns of easily identifiable objects took place all over Europe. Meanwhile, objects continued to be found. These are Polish church objects that had been swept up by the millions and were in the American collecting points. This sort of thing continued to be found for years, and and these are Jewish books found at which eventually went to the collecting point at Offenbach. In the case of the church objects, they were sent back to Poland. In the case of the Judaica, they were often returned to successor organizations. But of course, a great deal was not found, especially things that had not been officially looted or that had gone into the art markets or to the Soviet Union. As I mentioned before, the restitution commissions in each country then had the task of determining individual ownership. Sometimes this was easy. This is the Vermeer's astronomer from the Rothschild collection. Indeed, the higher the quality of the work, the easier it was, a Chardin from the Mannheimer collection. But some things had complicated issues, especially if they'd been bought and sold during the war. Other objects were first confiscated and then sold off by the Nazis as not suitable for their citizens because they were degenerate or Slavic kitsch. Some went to the market through operations like that of Muhlmann that I described before, and a large number were sold at auction or on the art market by dealers and individuals, sometimes under duress and sometimes not. By now, many of these works can be anywhere in the world. Today, the determination of what constituted duress in these transactions, this is the Chernin Vermeer, the artist in the studio now in Vienna. The family later claimed that they had sold, it was a forced sale, but documents that we actually have in the National Archives in Washington prove quite the contrary. So it was then retained by the Austrian museums. But determining what constituted duress when it's not documented is one of the most difficult problems facing the successors to post-war restitution commissions. As knowledge of the complexity of wartime events has increased Attitudes towards these transactions have also changed and continue to do so. But one thing has become very clear. All transactions must be considered on a case-by-case basis within the context of public and private events in the location and at the time of the transaction. This fact emphasizes the enormous need for non-adversarial, objective research and the funding to support it. One only need turn to the issue of the recent Munich Trove to illustrate this. The fact that Hildeband Gurlitt was engaged in marketing degenerate art and later involved in the operations of the Linz Agency seems completely damning. The media and various organizations clamor for immediate allocation of everything, but it's really not so simple. We cannot ignore the fact that Gurlitt, who was a dealer before, during, and after the war, had undoubtedly bought many of the works found in Munich legally. Nor can we ignore the fact that he had been fired twice from his job for promoting modern art, that he was part Jewish, and that he used his profession and expertise to survive in Nazi Germany. It's also clear, however, that a number of the items in this collection were looted, like this Matisse from the Rosenberg collection, and should be restituted. But even with apparently obvious cases like this one, the path of the work must be carefully documented. And it's only with well-coordinated and objective research that will take a great deal of time that the facts about each work will come to light so that justice can be done. And there's really no black and white in these cases. Ever since the revival of restitution in the late 90s, there's been a quest for a global solution to the problem. This is really an impossible dream. The present patchwork of restitution standards has resulted in considerable shopping around of claims and counterclaims as various constituencies seek a fair hearing. Each national restitution committee has its own, often arbitrary rules. The patchwork reaches deep, even into research standards. There is, for example, no universal standard for description in a provenance, but we can now at least aspire to some sort of uniformity of basic definitions and standards. Practically every institution writes provenance differently, and as a result, research is endlessly duplicated. With the remarkable transformation of research methodologies introduced by the internet, uniform standards have become much more possible. And there's also not been any serious attempt to regulate the art trade, still vast, international, and secretive, which of course is part of its attraction. The good news is that all the attention brought to the issues of looting has produced an avalanche, ever growing, of highly accessible information, the support of many governments, claimant organizations, and the dedicated work of professionals from major art institutions, libraries, and archives all over the world. There is much more to be done, but this work will not be wasted, even when the last looted item is returned. The techniques of modern provenance research can be applied to many areas and arenas and will add immeasurably to the general historical record. The restitutions commissions that you will hear from later have very difficult tasks. They must balance national and international political pressure, the rights both of claimants and good faith owners, as well as comply with the laws of many jurisdictions. No easy job. I feel very strongly that we cannot today think of restitution in the terms of the early post-war years. We know much more now. The research of the intervening years must be taken into account, and with sufficient knowledge and proper objectivity, I believe that satisfactory settlements can be reached. This has already taken place in many cases, such as that of this Mostart from an American museum, which was from the Czartoryski collection and has now been returned to Poland after a relatively short negotiation, and this sort of thing is surely possible in many more cases. In the restitution process, the exchange of information is key. Despite the excellent efforts of scholars and the publication of lists of objects still missing from private and public collections, the status of Polish wartime losses and recoveries is generally not well known. So I look forward with special pleasure to the papers that will be presented here in the next days that will inform us more widely on this subject. Thank you very much.
Chciałbym bardzo serdecznie podziękować pani za tak szeroko
Thank for the very broad presentation of the issue, showing on the one hand the tragedy that was experienced by Poland and the presentation of the fate of Polish collections. Also, I would like to thank for some conclusions and indications concerning further actions, also with the regaining restitution of objects. Also, I would like to thank for the paper, because it's really difficult to imagine a better introduction to our conference, which will study and analyze specific cases. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite Professor Andrzej Mariinsky, who is the author. I'm going to say it at the start because it is the first book that I read. It's the monography of Jan Działyński. But for many years, Mr. Mariinsky has been studying the collections of many Polish libraries during the German occupation, and he is the author of the book published in 2003 together with Hanna Łaskarzewska. It's about academic libraries in the general government in the period 1939-1945. He is also the author of the book Commander Paulsen, which was published in 2008, and also the libraries of Warsaw in the period 1939-1945, which is extremely important for all the academics studying the history of Warsaw, and it was also rewarded as the best Warsaw history book. He worked in many scientific and academic libraries, the Academic of Polish Parliament and the Library of the Castle in Kornik. And now I would like to invite him to discuss the looting of artworks on occupied territories, decision centers, methods, competence conflicts and results. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I would like to add, to make it more specific, that apart from Commander Paulsen, I also published the book in German, which is quite interesting, I think. In my presentation, I would like to limit myself to the lootings of movable art objects which were carried out by specific institutions of the occupying forces. So I will neglect, for the purposes of this paper, which were occurred by bombings, by the movements of the war front, and also the lootings of the marauders, and also the breaking of the resistance of Warsaw, which capitulated on the 8th September 1939. The occupying forces were facing the task of safeguarding the artworks and the cultural assets. It all depended on the territory, because Poland was divided into three zones: general government, western areas, the areas which were included in Germany, and the lands which were under Soviet occupation. General government, which I'm going to talk about most, covered 145 square kilometers. What was found there were the cities which were the centers of Polish culture: Krakow, Warsaw, and Lviv. And numerously, the academics wanted to analyze the strategy of occupying forces, because at the start there was no such strategy. Quite contrary, there was a complete chaos. So there are only urban legends concerning institutions of the Third Reich which prepared the plans of lootings of specific museums and so there were no specific plans for lootings which could be divided into the institutions of culture or any other. There were no such plans beforehand. But eminent Polish historians such as Karol Streicher and Stanisław Lorenz were sure that such lootings will take place, and Stanisław Lorenz testified at the post-war process of Ludwig Fischer, who was the governor of Warsaw, and who said and claimed that the lootings of Polish artworks started immediately after the German invasion of Warsaw, and this was on the basis of plans which had been prepared since 1933 by a special scientific institution that was created with that purpose in Königsberg and in Berlin. So Lorenz was absolutely positive about it, but the issue is that it was only his conviction. Until today, there are no documents proving that such plans or institutions had existed with such a particular purpose. The documents would point to the fact that at the start there was a complete chaos. The occupying forces were convinced that all cultural assets on the invaded areas have no owners, so that they could be disposed of freely. And the newly created German offices and boards had the purpose of looting these works. The same convictions was among the police forces in Berlin. The main board of the security of the Third Reich sent to the general government a special ward, Commander Paulsen, which was meant to deal with the artworks, and it was meant to study the history of the German heritage. Commander Paulsen consisted of archaeologists, really the cream of the cream of German archaeologists and art historians, because Himmler was obsessed with searching of archaeological traces of German presence there. Commander Paulsen was created for special tasks. So, for example, as Wolfgang heads to protect and secure historic archaeological findings, because Germans were convinced that Polish archaeologists were falsifying the findings. That is why they decided to displace all their documentation. Before going to Poland, Commander Paulsen was equipped with a special list of objects to be looted. This list, made on the 15th of September, was very specific, and it was made on the basis of standard materials that were available in Berlin. In many cities, they listed 28 museums and other institutions worth of notice. A more detailed list was prepared and sent to Berlin by him on 18th September by the director of a special prehistoric museum in Breslau. Also, the list comprised 8 scientific institutions. So Paulsen, on the 1st October, set up for the first journey to Poland. But his plan was not to protect archaeological findings. His purpose was to take the figures of the White Stos altarpiece, which were hidden in the cathedral in Sandomierz. And also, what we learn was that the Paulsen staff was not interested in archaeology, but Paulsen's commander was rather interested in enlarging the group of tasks of commando to bring all valuable cultural assets in Poland, that's a quote, which have any value or significance for the issue of German presence in Europe. Paulsen's staff enlarged also this directive, looting everything which of material or cultural value, and it was looted Also the collections of the State Archaeological Museum in Warsaw, but also the assets from various fields were taken, and there was quite difficult to find any common denominator. A special courier took the suppressed codex from the Zamość library, which was a manuscript from the 11th century, but also 4 stuffed bisons from the Museum of Natural History. And also commando members evaluated them to be a value of 5 million of Reichsmark. So actually it was the commercial value. What was preserved was the list of the objects, and this proves that the actions were quite chaotic and not pre-planned. They consisted in the penetration of various objects and institutions with the purpose to document the objects of Germanic art and culture. Commando was very enthusiastic about the quest of Poland because they were convinced that all the loots and troves will be quite easy. But this was not the case, because in Warsaw it was Wehrmacht that opposed the actions of Commander Paulsen, and its commanders actually claimed that they would shoot anyone who would try to displace the objects of art. So it was a typical conflict between SS and Wehrmacht, typical for the Third Reich. And on the 26th of October, it was taken over by civilian administration, because on that day, by the order of Hitler, the general government was set up. However, formally, there were some similar attributes in the general government like in any other state, because they had state borders and their own governing institutions. It was governed by the governor Hans Frank, and its organ was a special government. They had also their own militia, their own police forces. And also they believed that the objects of art on the territory of the general government belonged personally to the governor. It was not only the feature of the governor, because some other strong representatives of German authority felt to be the owners of all the assets in the general government. For example, it was forbidden for police forces to take away the objects of art from Pomerania, and this order was really observed. It was not the order meant to respect local traditions at all. Rather, it was dictated by the sense of ownership. It's my area and my own monuments and my own assets. That is why Hans Frank ruled the Germanized general government. He planned to create, after the war, the great German university in Krakow, and this was the purpose and the reason why he did not allow for the removal of the precious codes and manuscripts from the libraries of Krakow, because they were meant to be the decoration of the great post-war library of the university. Hans Frank was quite efficient in controlling chaos after the creation of the general government. He created a special plenipotentiary for making a special stock listing of all the cultural assets, and from that moment on, the decisions concerning all objects of art belonged to that special office. And it was all sent by Hermann Göring, by the director of the four-year plan, which was authorized to acquire all the artworks on the occupied territories. He tried to control the actions of Göring. Milman, however, had the exclusivity in managing all the goods. At the end of November, Frank issued, upon the request of Milman, a special order, according to which all the looted shootings, all the removal of objects of art from general government should be stopped before the full stock-taking list is done. This event is underestimated by historians, but this stopped actually the very fast actions of Commander Paulsen and prevented them from further actions. And since that moment, all the institutions were, the removal of objects from all institutions was stopped. Frank also issued an order which was published in the official journal, which stipulated that all the assets taken away from the current territories of general government should be returned and under this pressure, all the objects looted by Commander Paulsen were returned. For example, the Warsaw Code, the Supras Code returned to Warsaw. Also, how many objects returned, it's hard to say, but this comprised 3 great paintings from Czartoryski collections, which were in the sole discretion of Hans Frank. Such conflicts and disputes, sometimes victorious, were carried out by the administration of the general government with German police, which was the reflection of the general disputation of the rule over general government, which was embodied by the conflict between Frank and Himmler. But Frank had the support of Hitler, and thanks to that he was efficient in supporting and safeguarding his ownership in the general government. He also had the chance to loot many collections, both private and public ones. There were many confiscations actions, and all the objects were stored, for example, in Wawel Castle or in Warsaw. Before October 1942, the stores housed 99% of the objects of art of the general government. The administration of the general government had the full control of all these objects. It was not clear what the fate of these objects would be. Everyone waited, like in the entire Third Reich, for the period after the war. So they were repeating it like a mantra, after the war, after the war. But this was meant to complete German collections, as this was understood by the American officers in 1945. However, German museum directors were not interested in taking over such a great number of Polish exhibits because they did not value them high. Hitler's representative, Hans Posse, who was mentioned by the previous speaker, was meant to look for objects of art, mostly paintings, for the newly created museum in Linz. But he realized that there are very few objects. He claimed that there were very few objects which would actually improve the quality of the newly created museum. The plans concerning the objects were exemplified by the 3 categories. The first category comprised very few objects of world class, which were meant to be sent to the institution of the victorious Reich. The second category were of lesser degree, and they should be included into the museums. And the third category were only decorative objects, which should be meant to be designated for private owners of German institutions. Occupying forces solved also the issues of libraries and archives. The first step was to close them for the Polish users and to open them for the German visitors and users. These institutions were meant to serve German academics, strengthening the German presence in the East. And the scientific institutions were reorganized. In Krakow, Warsaw, Lviv, in Lublin, there were state institutions, state libraries created, which collected all the libraries from other places. And these libraries housed about 6 million items. The most of them managed to survive war. and Commando Polsen were defined, first of all, as the political library. What was perished was about 40,000 volumes of special collections from Warsaw museums, or, for example, the objects that were taken from Russia on the basis of the Treaty of Riga, which were housed in the building of Krasiński Library, which was burned down in October 1944 after the Warsaw Uprising. But Poland realized that there were no entire library collections sent to Germany, although there are many legends saying that it actually happened. But there were some single items which were lost and which cannot be required even now. In spite of many searches in non-post-war collections, no manuscript coming from the lootings of Polish library was found. There are many legends, but they have never been verified. However, the fate of archives was quite different. So, for example, the German Directorate of Archives was very well prepared. They came to Poland with very well prepared reivindication plans. They sealed all the military files and they took them to Germany. Especially, this concerned the documentation of the German presence in Poland. So they took all the files concerning the German military actions, and they were lost for Poland forever. And the Germans excluded and sent to Königsberg 74 documents which were published in the 16th century and which were given to the Polish king by the Teutonic Order Knights. They are still present in German archives, and they are a bone of contention in restitution actions between Poland and Germany. The areas of the western and northern Poland were incorporated in the Third Reich. Because of the unconditional Germanizations of this area, the lootings of cultural objects there were much more efficient and faster. Also, there were some decisions concerning the methods and scope of the looting of Polish actions. Himmler issued an order imposing the confiscation of all cultural assets which were in public collections. There were special confiscating groups which closely cooperated with the police, secured and safeguarded the exhibits of 15 museums, 5 collections, and many other archives. For example, they confiscated 1,100 paintings from private collections. We need to remember that Wielkopolska, that is in western Poland, was very well developed as far as nobility manners, which were decorated with many art objects. Some of the objects were stored, and some of the objects were sold. This comprised also books, for example, 4 million. The collections which remained in Polish stores on the lands incorporated in Germany, they survived until the liberation. To sum up, I would like to say that in the first days of German occupation, there was a great chaos. So, because there were conflicts of competence and conflicts of decisions. Some of the objects of art were protected by Wehrmacht. A special role was played by Commander Polsen, which was meant to loot the objects with great material and historic or cultural values. And the protection of entire cultural objects were taken over by special office of Hitler's plenipotentiary, who had special authorizations and special prerogatives. And in many storage houses in Krakow and in Warsaw, he accumulated large numbers of art objects from Krakow and Warsaw. A more systematic looting was taking place on the lands incorporated to Germany. However, because of the lootings and storage, it was damaged and destroyed because of the storage and war actions. Uncontrolled looting of objects of art started when the Eastern Front Line arrived here. For example, there were many eminent works of art which were taken with no systematic measure to Germany to save them from Soviet invaders. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bardzo dziękuję panu profesorowi.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this very important paper based on source material, which showed the mechanisms of Nazi institutions' operations in looting works of art, libraries and archives, and in which you also emphasized, and this is especially important for us, the chaos in the first period of the operations, and that also showed the different levels of preparation when it came to works of art and when it came to collections of books and archives. This paper was extremely important. Okay, and now I'd like to invite you to a 15-minute coffee break, and we'll reconvene 12:30.